As a teenager, I worked on this newspaper here in New York. And we focused on all sorts of issues, political issues, social issues, personal stories. And the founder of the organization was looking at archives. And he found an article that I wrote profiling Cesar Perales, the founder of Latino Justice Pearl Deaf. Then he was working in New York State government, but he was talking about his history as what he called a poverty lawyer and his work in starting up Latino Justice Pearl Deaf. Talk about the kismet that I would actually become president and general counsel almost 38 years later after I interviewed him as a young person in college. It was almost as if my fate was written, and I wrote it many years ago.
Just over 50 years ago, the Puerto Rican community in New York was beginning to come into its own. I remember at the time that the Puerto Rican Day Parade was beginning to attract people. Antonia Pantoja had started Aspira with a group of educators. The Young Lords had very recently come into their own. So we saw activists challenging the system. We saw people working within the system in order to advance the interests of the Puerto Rican community. But we didn't have, at that time, an agency, an organization that was going to legally challenge those obstacles that were keeping the community back. There were three of us, three lawyers who worked for the city government, who would frequently meet and talk about the fact that we had to create an organization if no one else was going to do it.
Cesar Perales and Jorge Batista and I were all working for the same agency in the city of New York, the Model Cities Administration. That's where we met and began talking about the idea of creating a fund to provide for litigation in order to improve conditions among Puerto Ricans and other Latinos.
It was a heady time. It was the Great Society. It was John Lindsay as mayor. There was a lot of energy in the environment for people to do things to improve and to reduce poverty. There was a war against poverty. And at least I sensed a receptiveness, not only in the local community, but in the city and in the country, really, in the news, to helping the people who were disadvantaged.
The Supreme Court had already, of course, ruled segregation in public schools unconstitutional, discrimination in housing unconstitutional, to require one person, one vote. Congress got in on the act with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 65. So that was all part of the movement that was going on. Cesar and Jorge and I talked about, well, how do we get in on the bottom of those efforts, because the Puerto Rican Latino communities had their issues of their own. For example, in New York, there was a problem of bilingual education. In voting, Puerto Ricans and Latinos went to the ballot box and they had ballots that they could not understand who they were supposed to be voting for or for what. Migrant workers, they were being discriminated against in their wages. So again, those are unique issues that the Latino and Puerto Rican community faced at that time that we thought warranted an organization like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
The raising of money became the big challenge. Father Fitzpatrick was part of the Jesuit group at Fordham. In my mind, he was the patron saint of the Puerto Rican community at that point. He did so many good things to help us. And he had tremendous contacts. And he told me to call this one, call that one. And then Victor, it turned out, had good contacts. And so we started visiting people at foundations.
One day, Victor tells me that we were going to meet a staffer for Ted Kennedy. And I, being my usual brass self, said, when it comes down to explaining what we're trying to do, let me do the talking.
We knocked on the door, and
We are greeted by Ted Kennedy himself.
he says, "Hi, I'm Ted Kennedy."
And Cessa froze.
It's the only time in his life that he's been speechless.
A shocking moment for young Cesar Barras.
It was a clear setup, and they knew that I would be taken aback by the presence of one of the Kennedy brothers. What makes this relevant is that Ted Kennedy opened doors for us at the Ford Foundation and a couple of other foundations. I mean, when Ted Kennedy would call the president of the foundation and said, "I want you to do something, I want you to meet some young guys who have, I think, an incredibly important idea," it happened.
We then made the first success with a small family foundation that gave us $25,000, and that opened the door then to greater funding from the Ford Foundation that enabled us to open the doors in 1972.
The chartering documents of the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund are based in part on the chartering documents of the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, which was founded about 2 years earlier in San Antonio. So we're looking at a period of time in which legal defense funds, all premised on the grandfather of all legal defense funds, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, still uses the basic model of test cases, impact cases to challenge institutions that create marginalization.
The biggest challenge was credibility even within our community. Just because you managed to get enough money to open up a law office doesn't mean that some guy sitting in El Barrio knows who you are, that you're even there. But fortunately, I had promised Antonia Pantoja that we would bring a lawsuit to ensure that services were provided to non-English speaking Puerto Rican kids.
ASPIDA was headed by a landmark person, a legend in our community, Antonia Pantoja, and she made her life that of improving education for our community. And one of the issues that ASPIDA was behind was bilingual education.
To me, it wasn't just a question of bilingual education, it was a question of opportunity to get an education.
Hispanic students came off the plane or the boat and they were enrolled in school, and lo and behold, they were placed in classrooms where they did not understand anything.
They were literally being ignored. I mean, as Tony put it, they sat in the back of the room and learned nothing, and in a couple of years dropped out of school. It was clear to me that a very, very important lawsuit was in the making. And ASPIDA must get credit for finding the clients for us. Parents of young kids who were very unhappy with the education their kids were getting.
That became the first major opportunity. We had a client, very New York oriented. It wasn't a research reaction. It was a immersion in a community with needs.
The Board of Education basically said, there is no such right that you're seeking to enforce. You don't have a cause of action. There was an exchange of papers, motions being made, decisions being made, all of which were going in our favor.
Eventually, the case was settled, agreeing to a consent decree that was ordered by a federal court in New York.
It ultimately ended up establishing in New York City the right to special programs if you did not speak English. Another thing it would do would require the hiring of people who could provide bilingual education. This was, in essence, rather revolutionary. We got many, many people jobs as teachers. People who incidentally had been denied jobs because they had an accent. So that by breaking down these legal barriers, we also created job opportunities and hastened the development of the Puerto Rican middle class in New York.
I spent 30 years in New York media, and so I came in contact with Latino justice many times in different forms. When we look to, well, who's representing, who's the voice of the Latino community, it was really important that we have that voice, that we go to the experts, if you will, the legal experts, and that we had this entity that had a lot of credibility.
Well, the late 1970s for Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund was really a major period of activity.
The fund brought an action against the city of New York claiming that Hispanics and others who did not speak English were being denied the right to vote because they were given ballots that were in English and they could not understand them.
You know, Puerto Ricans, you're citizens by birth. You know, if you're in Puerto Rico, that's okay because everything's in Spanish. But then once if you relocate for whatever reason, you have these artificial barriers or obstacles. And so Pearl Duff was standing up for folks.
We eventually got the bilingual voting arrangements that are still in place. I see them now. Vote aquí. That's one of our contributions to the Western civilization.
We were attacking entrance examinations, the examinations for promotions to sergeant, lieutenant. A lot of those examinations were testing for things that had nothing to do with being a very good police officer. Just years before I started working at Puerto Rican Legal, it brought lawsuits to knock down the height requirement to become a police officer in New York City. I think you had to be 5'9", on the assumption that if you're 5'8", you can never be a good police officer. There were major inroads in employment cases, especially around the uniformed services.
The test requirements and the promotions for Latinos within the police department, the fire department, municipal jobs, civil service jobs, those are plum positions, good salary, benefits, and Latinos, Puerto Ricans were not necessarily accessing those, so Pearl Duff was kind of standing up.
There were also major victories in the area of housing. There was excessive amount of exclusionary practices by many groups, and oftentimes it was in government housing. So we had to sue the government and nonprofits just to get our foot in the door, so to speak.
After I served in the Carter administration, I was then asked by some people on the board to consider coming back. My fealty to the organization was important. I also knew that redistricting as a result of reapportionment was about to take place, and that this was a tremendous opportunity to address the issue of gerrymandering, which was vicious in New York, truly vicious. Their argument was there was no racial intent. But when you have the Latino community growing dramatically and all of the others losing their constituency, they had to do some artistic gerrymandering to ensure no more Latinos got elected.
We represented the famous Gilberto Gerena Valentin, a maverick council member from the Bronx, one of the biggest leaders of the independence of Puerto Rico, one of the biggest human rights activists in all of New York City. And the powers that be, the entrenched powers of City Hall, thought that we were not only crazy, but wrong legally. We were a little crazy, but right legally.
It was on the eve of the election that the Supreme Court agrees that this case has got to be heard, that there is evidence of racial gerrymandering. New Yorkers, 1 or 2 days before the election for mayor and the city council, woke up and read a headline that this decision had, in essence, stopped the election in New York.
This was a way of pushing back against the Koch regime. He was super popular, got reelected regardless, but this was the first time that there was a chink in his armor.
The result, of course, is that there is a settlement. They agree to draw new lines. The new lines resulted in more Latinos being elected, and we, in essence, learned how to bring these lawsuits.
We became experts in redistricting, in quick fashion. We had to because we were doing it. We had to because redistricting only happens once every 10 years.
We challenged lawsuits not just in other parts of New York State, but all over the East. We went to Chicago, and we sat down with Valdef and figured out a way to bring a lawsuit there. It was the first time we actually partnered with another civil rights organization. And we've been friends and compatriots and colleagues since that time.
At that time, the number of Puerto Ricans and Latinos practicing law in this area was dismally low. We joke that at that time, the Puerto Rican Bar Association would meet in a back room at the Quixote Hotel, and all 10 of us, whatever the number. So one of the issues that we wanted to tackle was how to promote education among Puerto Ricans so that they would be interested in the law and in going to law school. And so that became the second prong of the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, how to get more lawyers to serve in the community at large.
One of the people we initially hired was the education director, who would work with students, negotiate discounted rates for students to get a prep exam for the law school aptitude test, and in essence, advocate for them. That was the beginning of what has become a tremendous history. I keep running into lawyers who tell me, I got into law school probably because I took that free LSAT course at Pearl Dev.
Here I was, the first one in our family to go off to college. I knew as a child that I wanted to be a lawyer. But it wasn't like I had friends who were lawyers or family members who were lawyers. I didn't know what that necessarily looked like.
I entered law school in the early 1980s, and it was culture shock. Looking to identify, connect, I heard about Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, and I met an individual by the name of Luis de Graaf.
De Graaf was this tall guy with an afro who came in, and he was the one who was taking away that curtain.
Luis was a former young lord, was a social justice advocate, a lifelong public interest lawyer, and I've now been a public interest lawyer for 37 years, so I think that kind of speaks to the impact he had.
That was my first experience with Latino justice, and it was a very powerful one. It had an impact on my professional life because through that, I'm a lawyer today.
The founders thought the education pipeline programs were important, and they have been part of the organization since inception. But then we have some newer programs.
One of the things that I feel really, really proud about, and one of the projects that I worked on, was being the architect of the CLASS program.
Our CLASS program, which is our corporate law firm Aligned Summer program, which pairs a corporation and a law firm, for this perfect sort of internship for current law students. So it sets them up for an internship their first summer with a corporation, their second summer at the firm.
So it was really exciting because it was giving them an opportunity to be in firms that most often chose students from the most elite schools in the country. And it was a huge success.
So far, fingers crossed, the program has had a 100% success rate in getting students into big law. So we are diversifying the field. We have just really a spectrum of students that we're seeing. And what they come back and say to me is, thank you for these programs, thank you for these resources. These conversations aren't being had, or at least aren't being had by people that look like me, that have had a similar lived experience as I have.
We knew that our students could do it. We just had to give the corporate sector and the big law an opportunity to see what our kids could do.
I have decided to nominate an inspiring woman who I believe will make a great justice, Judge Sonia Sotomayor of the great state of New York.
At one point, the chair of our board was Jose Cabranes, a federal judge, and he wanted to bring on some younger people. And one of the ones he recommended was Sonia Sotomayor, whom he knew from Yale. We fell in love with her, and she served on our board for a number of years. Little do we know that those who objected to her used her service on our board of directors as evidence of her being a radical leftist Latina.
Senator Jeff Sessions, on the Senate floor during a Judiciary Committee, was blasting Justice Sotomayor for having served on the board of the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, a radical revolutionary group. Remember, somebody texted on my BlackBerry, go, say what? The senator is accusing us of what? So the Senate Judiciary Committee then engaged in a fishing expedition. They sent a subpoena to Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund asking for all the records, all the board records from the 1980s, 90s. We had a volunteer team. We went through every box, every piece of paper. As we all know, the outcome of this fantastic story is that she was confirmed overwhelmingly to sit on the Supreme Court, and she has to this day served with great distinction and honor.
Sonia Sotomayor's confirmation was very important, not just for Puerto Ricans from the Bronx public housing, but for the Latino community as a whole. But what makes me even more proud is the fact that she has conducted herself in a way that says, I'm a Latina, I am a progressive, I'm as smart as anybody else on this court, and she expresses that in her writings and in her statements constantly. And so it wasn't just that she got appointed, it's the job she has done on the United States Supreme Court that makes us so very, very proud of her.
So the chapter in the story about Latino justice that involves the name change from Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund to Latino justice is a painful one.
Literally, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund was going broke. They were not raising money. The chief executive, the president and general counsel, left at a time in which the place was having terrible financial problems. And this was seen as a death knell. This was, in the eyes of many, the end. I mean, things were really bad. There were debts piling up, staff not getting paid, and the only hope was somebody would come in and say, I'm here, this place isn't going to die, we're getting ourselves together. And I worked very, very hard trying to provide credibility. That's when we started considering changing the name. The issues that had been so blatant, so obvious when we started the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund, these civil service obstacles, this denial of educational opportunity, all of these things no longer were so flagrant. But what was happening was that the plight of immigrants was becoming flagrant. This was a big, big deal. When we attempted to bring lawsuits on behalf of migrants, many of the people we approached basically said, you're Puerto Ricans. Why are you worrying about Mexicans? Or why are you worrying about Guatemalans?
As a lawyer who was traveling around the country, it was always challenging to say, soy un abogado de Nueva York, del Fondo de Defensa Legal Derecho Puertorriqueño, y te quiero atender a ayudar. Say what? Why is a Puerto Rican lawyer, and I'm not Puerto Rican, you don't want to come here to Virginia or North Carolina and come help me?
It also became a problem with the funders. And so we struggled with the issue.
It was, internally and externally controversial at the very least.
I understand the pressures, that organizations go through in order to grow. And I believe the change was fueled by the desire to grow.
I think we were servicing a much larger community than we had originally. And I think that had to be taken into account.
But it was painful in that it felt that somehow Puerto Ricans would lose. And some of us still refer to it as PRODEF because we're stubborn Puerto Ricans.
Many Puerto Ricans were not happy. I don't know if they're any happier today, but it did give us greater credibility with other Latino groups. It also, once we started bringing lawsuits effectively protecting the rights of immigrants, it also helped us with funders.
This organization has always remained committed to its genesis and founding. Even when we changed the name to Latino Justice, Latino Justice PRODEF continues to work and engage in supporting efforts, suing the U.S. Navy about the bombing in Vieques, fighting, post-Irma Maria for Puerto Rico's right to self-determination, to escape its colonial status. So Latino Justice has never abandoned there, and we continue to champion and fight the rights of the greater Puerto Rican diaspora here in the United States and back on the island.
Latino Justice is really comprehensive and all-inclusive of the work that we're doing, the communities that we are representing, the constituents that we have come to our education programs. But I also see and understand keeping that foundation, right? We were founded as a Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, and that means something. So I love that they were able to keep both as Latino Justice, PRODEF. I think it signifies the current and future, but also where we came from and why it's so important to have that PRODEF.
So I think there was a time in the 90s where the organization, went kind of corporate, and it was really focused on law students and the law profession, all really great goals, but it wasn't really activist-minded. So for me, I think Hazleton was a really important case for Latino justice in 2006 because it was also a signal that they were coming back into the ring.
I joined as legal director in 2007, and if you recall that time, that was really where immigrants were being regularly and routinely bashed on the airwaves. Lou Dobbs, Bill O'Reilly. Immigrants were being demonized, falsely accused or blamed for all of the economic or societal ills. And so there was this huge anti-immigrant backlash, which manifested itself when places like Hazleton, Pennsylvania, began passing anti-immigrant ordinances.
There was no question that we were moving aggressively to represent the interests of immigrants.
Puerto Ricans are not immigrants, and many Puerto Ricans thought, well, that's not our issue, right? But when you're walking down the street, nobody knows whether you're Puerto Rican, Dominican, Mexican, or where you're from. It's very nuanced, right? And so for Latino Justice to take on that case was a signal that A, immigrants weren't alone, and B, none of us was isolated. Whatever discrimination and abuse was happening against immigrants, it happened to all of us. The same kind of pattern of abuse and discrimination.
Hazleton passed a local ordinance to make it a crime to rent to people who are undocumented, to make it a crime to employ them, to allow police more leeway in stopping individuals they suspect of being in the country illegally, and to declare English the official language of Hazleton, Pennsylvania. These things are tied.
This was the ordinance that, in essence, said, leave town.
The problem is that the ordinance is unconstitutional. So Puerto Rican Legal, along with the ACLU, brought a lawsuit together. Eventually we were successful, although it took several rounds of appeals and it took years to resolve. That didn't stop the anti-immigrant forces to use what they learned at the municipal level to then create a template of anti-immigrant state laws.
Had we lost Hazleton, I am convinced that there would have been laws like this passed in many, many jurisdictions, making life terrible for people who are undocumented in this country.
To me, it was an important decision. I think also it was a turning point for the organization. Juan's coming to Latino Justice is a big signal that we're building an army. Juan was not going to be the corporate guy, but he was going to be the guy to put us on the map and say, there's a team here that's going to protect our community.
We started to look for ways that we can address issues that were much more relevant in 2011 than they were necessarily in the 70s. And I mean necessarily because the issues of policing and profiling and the injustices of the criminal legal system are perennial issues. But that also means that these are symptoms and that the endemic problems are actually deeply rooted. And they're rooted in how people create stereotypes and act on those stereotypes. And these kind of stereotypes are unfortunately ingrained in all of us. So what we're seeing is manifestations that then develop, particularly in the criminal legal system. It develops in every system: healthcare systems, education systems, foster care systems, nutrition systems. But in the criminal legal system, the consequences are major.
I was at a dinner party and there were maybe 10 people there. Juan was there. And I said, you know, our community, we're afraid to talk about criminal justice and its impact. We've become convinced that our family members, our community members who are in trouble got in trouble and kind of deserve whatever they get. And we need to change that conversation because it's shrouded in shame. The very next day, Juan sent me this email where he said, you know, your comments really struck me because I spent my life doing this. You know, then he went diving in.
I was already building upon something that the organization had, but it never really spoke about it the way I want to speak about it. So when I got there, it was just bringing these threads together and then being very, very open about the war on drugs, for example. Very, very open about mass imprisonment, and very, very clear that these systems also impact the Latinx population in the United States.
Latino justice incursion into this kind of world starts to redefine how policies affected our community in a disparate way, right? If everyone who commits the same crime is treated equally, we're cool. But that's not what happens, right? And so the work that Latino justice starts to do in this realm is so important. Latino justice says we're about justice. And you can't be about justice unless you're fighting injustice. And so it's a very aggressive, assertive statement about who we are and what we intend to do.
By 2011, we had been there close to 40 years as an organization with the same kind of model. Lawyers in New York City who parachute into various jurisdictions and states, bring lawsuits, help people, then go back. And yes, it has a major impact, but it doesn't have continuity. The Puerto Rican diaspora was always centered in New York City, but now the Puerto Rican diaspora is centered in Florida, especially in Central Florida. We did a lot of diligence and searching, and we decided to open up an office in Orlando.
During Juan's tenure, we created our Southwest Regional Office in Austin, Texas, and we now have 2 full-time staff members. It's just amazing the growth and the continuing need for us, Latino Justice, to be active and be everywhere.
I'm really grateful for Juan Cartagena's contribution to the story of Latino justice because I think he just beautifully blended together the mission of continuing to recruit the legal minds and getting into the corporate rooms, but also he brought the activist that he was at heart. Not only does he do all that, but then upon his exit, opens up the opportunity to have a woman lead this organization.
I am so humbled and feel very privileged to take on the role of President and General Counsel of Latino Justice Pearl Deaf. There's so many opportunities, first, to build our capacity to do more of the work that it's been at the core of our mission for decades, and that is protecting voting rights and expanding access to the franchise for more and more Latinos, countering employment discrimination and fighting against worker exploitation, access to schools, to protecting immigrant rights. And we remain very devoted to working on behalf of Puerto Ricans here and on the island. And one of our biggest pieces of work is to grow leadership, to grow the next generation and the future generations of Latino leaders. I think the biggest challenge we're facing is that of capacity. Our services are certainly in demand. People in the Latino community are still facing obstacles, and our challenge is really picking and choosing who we assist, because we just don't have the capacity to go everywhere the demand is. So those are hard choices to make. And we are a public interest law firm. We're a firm of litigators. A lot of our lawyers are arguing cases, taking cases to trial. But one of the legacies of the Trump administration is now we have a federal court that is very hostile to our civil rights, and that includes the Supreme Court. So we can't depend on the courts to be the answer to all of the problems that we are facing. We think that doing more work on the state level to embed civil rights in our state laws and our state constitutions is probably the best strategy going forward to protect and uplift as many people in our community as possible. I want to grow our programs, but I also want to go and expand our reach. I want to take on some new issues, and two of the main issues that we're looking at right now are issues around racial justice and climate justice. We've always considered ourselves and are a racial justice organization, but we felt we needed to be more intentional about making sure that we are looking and doing our work through that lens. On the climate justice side, the research shows that Latinos live and work in the 3 states that are most impacted by climate change, Florida, Texas, or California. What we're seeing is their lives, where they work, where they live, are being damaged by flooding, by intense heat and fires, by drought. And so people are very concerned. What I would love to do is to see if there is a role for Latino justice in that space. Is there a way that we can fill a void? All of our work, we really look to see that we are taking a holistic view and not approaching it with one hammer, but a hammer, a screwdriver, a wrench, figuring out which tools you need to solve a particular problem, and make sure we have every tool we could possibly wield so that we really maximize our chances of being successful.
At the time that we were organizing the fund and were able to raise money for 1 year, the last thing that occurred to us was that this organization was going to be around 50 years from then.
I often think about the fact that things have changed in the 50 years. The kind of treatment that Puerto Ricans got 50 years ago does not seem to exist in the same way, whether it be housing, whether it be treatment in schools, things of that nature. But I do believe that we need a Pearl Deaf Latino justice as much today as we did 50 years ago. And I would like to think that we have an underpinning of great respect, support from the community that will allow Pearl Deaf Latino Justice to continue to do the kind of work they've done for the last 50 years.
To see our clients now being able to teach other people about the law is incredible. And to see our clients take leadership positions because they were emboldened by an organization like Puerto Rican Legal to actually take a stand, and it worked, is incredible. To see institutions change because of the threat of litigation is incredible. But then equally important to me is to see college students want to become law students, want to become lawyers. And that's the power of civil rights enforcement. It challenges gates that presume to be based on merit, but are usually not. They hide other forces. And when you finally succeed at doing something, and then you help people do it too, it doesn't get better than that.
The legacy of Latino justice to me is that we have this bench of superheroes who are ready for any battle in the legal realm and in the public narrative realm, right? To defend our history as Latinos in this country. And not just our history, our contributions, and not just our contributions, but our right, our very right to be here. I think it's hard for people today to understand how long it took to get there.